Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is Tim Keller, the auditor for the state of New Mexico. Thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thank you for bringing me on.
Well, you've been auditor since 2014. You served as a senator before then. I want to get back to some of your work in the Senate. But first, a lot of people ask me, well, what is the auditor? What does the auditor's office do? So let's just start with basics. What does the auditor do?
Sure, and it's a common question. Most people have no idea what the state auditor does. And it's an interesting position. So it's constitutionally elected and every 4 years along with the governor and the other state offices. And our job is really just to keep track of all the tax dollars in the state of New Mexico. And we do that by doing an annual audit as required by law. That's really our job. But what's interesting about the role is we audit state government and all 100+ state agencies, but we also audit all our local governments and school districts and universities. So there's actually 900 different entities that we're tasked with keeping track of. So it's a big job, and it's both very local and very statewide at the same time.
One of your things on your website says helping government work better. And accountability always helps everyone work better. So you provide transparency, oversight, accountability for all tax money. That's a huge job.
Yeah, and we really wanted to be proactively helping folks. And I know it's a little counterintuitive. How can an audit be helpful? But that's the original purpose. It might point out some issues and some flaws, but it's supposed to be essentially a series of things to fix for the following year. And that's in the best interest of all New Mexicans. So that's why we really view ourselves as helping, even if it might be like the dentist getting rid of a cavity.
Yeah.
It's for your own good.
Well, you actually set up for the first time in the auditor's office something called the Government Accountability Office. And what does that do?
Well, we thought, throughout the history of the office, there's all these annual audits that are done and some special investigations, but no one had really looked at what does this all mean statewide in terms of how we manage our money and in terms of our policies and their effectiveness. And so this office actually reads basically every audit and tries to find common themes that we can then hopefully suggest strong policy fixes for.
Well, now, speaking of state finances, we have a terrible fiscal and financial crisis. So I want you to tell me what's going on and how deep in debt we are and why that's unconstitutional. And then I need to ask you, as auditor, do you really examine all three branches of government, legislative, judicial, and executive? Because we're finding some holes in the behavior of some of these branches. First, what's wrong with our state finances right now?
Sure. Well, we have a situation where we have two problems. The first problem is the last year. So the last fiscal year is over.
It ended
July 1st.
Yeah.
And so 3 months later, we are quite sure that we essentially can't pay the bills from that year. And so we really can't close the books on last year. We're in the hole on last year. And then we have a forecast going forward for the current year that says we're going to be in the hole again. So the past year is a $200 million hole, and I'm rounding to make it easy.
Yeah.
And then going forward, we're looking at around $400 million. And so these are major problems, and a future deficit forecast is always something that's good to know in advance. But something that already happened, that's a real issue, and that's why we need to have a special session, because our state, by law, has to balance the budget, and that means we can't deficit spend. And I think a lot of folks, including our office, are concerned that we are breaking our own balanced budget amendment, if you will.
Well, when should a special session have been called? At the end of the fiscal year when we look back and said, oh my God, we owe $200 million?
Basically, yes. You always allow 30 to 60 days to essentially close the books because you have like accounts receivable and accounts payable. But basically around August, and this is also, I know, when the legislature became concerned, the legislature and our office became concerned that net, after you've settled everything out, we're short money, which is not allowed by state law in New Mexico. And so we really want these to be called automatically when that happens. There should be no politics. There should be really no discussion. We're breaking the law. We call a special session so that we are in compliance with our own laws. And we're still concerned about that because to date, we have yet to fix this problem.
Well, you wrote a letter to the governor simply stating the problem. By law, we cannot do deficit spending, and we already have. Let's get together and fix this. Well, we're taping this now. This will air the beginning of October. There's not much time left to call a special session, and it seems that the governor has been reluctant to call the lawmakers into session to fix this because of political considerations, because no fundraising can be done. The moment she issues the call for the special, there's no fundraising for legislative races, and the election is in November. So, but that is a political reason, and campaigning and fundraising should not come before the good of the state and our own state laws.
Right.
So what was her response to your letter?
Well, I think it was a very open letter. It was moderate in tone. It raised these issues. It made suggestions about what we should do. And we really wanted to have a dialogue on it because we think it's actually relatively easy to get legislators and the governor to admit that might be breaking the law, so we should have a special session. However, unfortunately, we got no response, nothing but silence. And in fact, really through the media, we actually sort of got this downplaying of the issue. And I think that's a real injustice for New Mexico because we're citing our own law. I mean, that's all we're doing.
They said that you were just being a political hack.
Yeah.
That's what her party said. And this is your job.
It is.
You are charged with the integrity of our finances more than anyone else. It's your job to check that.
That's right. And I think the greater concern for folks, and should be the governors, if we don't do this, we're going to have an audit, which we're doing to find out if we really are in compliance. If that says that we're not, it's likely our bond rating will go down. And that might not sound interesting to everyday New Mexicans, but that is a terrible problem because that means interest rates go up. And basically what it means is we have less money for schools, roads, bridges, everything like that we bond for. And so this is an issue that should be nonpartisan. It should be have nothing to do with timing or anything of that nature. And it shouldn't matter who the messenger is. We need to close out the books. We need to do it right away. And we need to make sure that we don't end up costing our state down the road.
So what people have to understand is that there are actual consequences of this failure to act. And so there's a whole system of rating states by bond agencies, Moody's and things like that. And so if our rating falls, they're able to charge us more to borrow money for, which states always have to do for big projects. And so here we are already in the hole, and this will just make us deeper in the hole. We got we're always at the bottom of so many lists, but we were the top of the worst managed state. We came in number one. And somebody has to be interested in managing our state properly. And so there's also a matter of respect for the Constitution and respect for citizens. So how can we light a fire? How can we get this going?
I think in that list, that's obviously one of the worst lists to be at the top of. And I think we've seen, regardless, over the last 6 years, there's just a question of priorities for our state. And every elected official chooses priorities. And, this governor recently has prioritized the death penalty, for example. And that is every elected official's right to do. And it is the role of the governor to do that. But what has always been the case throughout New Mexico is that we take our balanced budget seriously. And historically, at least, I've been following politics at least through 3 governors now, and I've heard about governors in the past. And this issue was never not a priority when things were this bad. And so I really think at the end of the day, New Mexicans, at a minimum, they want our state financially solvent. And that's what we should focus on this week.
So if it turns out to be one day to deal with this huge financial crisis, to throw an issue like the death penalty, in 40 years, there's been one execution, and that was voluntary. Our other issues, child poverty, child hunger, the economy, lack of jobs, the mass exodus from the state. Where does the death penalty rank in that? Now the governor wants to put in 3 strikes, a law that's been proven to be ineffective, and actually we can't afford either the death penalty because it's several $1,000,000 for one death penalty case, and we're cutting back what we're paying our jurors from $750 to $450. I mean, we don't have the money for 3 strikes, and we don't have the money for the death penalty, but when you talk about setting priorities, we need visionary leadership. We need somebody who can step up and look at the problem and say, this is what we're going to do. You did have one suggestion that the lawmakers might put in a bill that when we reach a certain amount of money in the hole, it automatically triggers a special session. It's not a political agenda. It's not even the governor's call. When the auditor presents to the lawmakers the fact that, okay, we're already $200 million in the hole, we have to stop the bleeding. So how would you set up a trigger bill like that?
You know, I think it would really go through the consensus forecast process. So we have actually a relatively well-working system where DFA, so the executive branch, and LFC and the legislative branch, they make these forecasts. And I think if they agree that we're past a certain threshold, let's say 10%, because it's usually our reserve rate, something to that effect, it should trigger a special. And that really would take the politics out of it. And I think in many ways, those types of folks and those state workers and legislators who are into those issues, I think they would agree with that. The people who don't agree with that are folks who really sort of want to cling on to power. And at the end of the day, I think what we're seeing is, it's like a sort of scapegoat. Let's not focus on the real hard issues that we all have to come together to solve. Instead, let's have this kind of poll-tested vote on the death penalty. And I think that is distracting from the real root causes and challenges in our state right now.
And let's face it, we can't even handle the budget deficit in one day.
Well, certainly, in the long term, we have 2, and I think, we could plug the past deficit in a short amount of time. But it's going to take a long time to figure out what to do down the road, and we're going to see that in the upcoming session, whether it's raise taxes or increase revenue or cut spending. And that kind of thing should be done in an open and transparent process, just like every other bill that we pass. And I don't think it really does New Mexicans a justice to see people walk in the door and vote and leave. That's not deliberative democracy. That's not what our founders intended at the state or national level.
Well, Mr. Keller, one thing that you've done so well is you come up with these little piles of money. You had one last year, money on the side, $4 billion, that was just languishing. It's true some of it had strings on it, but there was some that we could, as John Arthur Smith says, claw back. And now you come up just this month with this insurance premium tax deficit where insurance companies are supposed to be paying this tax, but they've been on the honor system, and lo and behold, it turns out they owe $193 million. That would really help us with last year's deficit. And so the superintendent of insurance has allowed them to self-report, and they've been underreporting. And so when you put your pencil to it, they owed us all this extra money. That would just be wonderful to get that. We really need that.
Yeah, and this is something, a credit a little bit to the legislature and even the superintendent who have raised this issue for years. But what we always were missing was sort of evidence or an audit, essentially, to spell it out. And the legislature put in money to have a separate firm do it. So we oversaw the process, but a private firm, Clifton Larson Allen, did the work. And, they basically found that the honor system is inadequate. And we know this from our own personal taxes. If no one ever got audited, I'm sure tax collection would go down. And that's basically what's happening. And it's not the company's fault as of now, because it's the agency's responsibility to essentially notify and audit them first. So until that happens, there will be no change. And that's why we're saying, number one, let's collect the back taxes that you can prove. And number two, going forward, let's do this right. And there's 300 million a year that come through in this. And so we looked at over the last 5 years and found 200 million possibly owed. But we think this is just the tip of the iceberg. We only tested about a quarter of the insurance that's collected. So going forward, this actually might be very helpful to the budget annually as well.
Well, you guys are so busy over there. Another thing that you're tasked with looking for is conflicts of interest or favored treatment. One of the things that just came up recently was that the town of Jow has been given a sweetheart deal to a local wealthy rancher, paying a third of what everyone else in the community is paying for water. I know that's ongoing, but that's a sort of special interest thing that you have to be on guard for.
Absolutely. And we've seen, all around the state, it's amazing what pops up. And this water fraud issue now, this will be our 4th municipality. So we're about to release some issues in Moriarty, where there was essentially the same likely fraud activity. We found it in Alamogordo. We found some issues in Las Vegas, and now we're hearing about Jow. We've even done a statewide advisory on how states govern their water billing. And the situation in Jow, though, seems to be very specific. So we're investigating it right now, and we'll see where that goes. But we now are not surprised when we hear about municipalities having some challenges with their water billing.
Well, we're speaking today with Tim Keller, the auditor for the state of New Mexico. And I'm always surprised at the breadth of issues that you look at. Medical marijuana patient cards, by law, a patient who applies should be either approved or denied within 30 days. It is now taking 90 days. And it was the Lynn and Aaron Compassionate Use Act. What's happening with that? And did the Department of Health take a chunk of their money that they needed to process all of this? Wasn't it like $127,000?
Yeah, and they really, a couple of things. This one is interesting because when I was an intern helping out in the Roundhouse, I worked on the Lynn and Aaron Compassionate Use Act. And so it was something I was always wanted to make sure did the right thing, basically. And what we've seen is, I think, a similar theme of not prioritizing government sort of complying with its own laws and following through on what we ask government to do. So hopefully, let me just state that the department says that they've corrected this issue. And that's a good thing if they have. And we're going to audit it, and in November we'll find out if that's true. But how they got in this mess was really, the number of growers they increased and the number of users increased. But for whatever reason, there wasn't enough management foresight to ramp up processing staff. And so they got in this situation where demand went way up and they couldn't process things fast enough. And when we say these terms, in this case, why we thought it was so important, this is medicine for the sick. That's what our law is about. It's a medical marijuana statute. And so that's why we felt the need to jump in right away, because this was more than waste. Government waste or bureaucracy getting in the way. This is sick folks not getting their medicine. And that creates all sorts of individual problems. And I know it's one of the things that we've probably received the most thank yous for really coming down hard on the department, because this is an important issue.
Yeah, and these people are in pain.
That's
and
right.
There's another kind of pain that you're addressing, the rape backlog audit. 5,000 cases. So this is 5,000 victims and their family, and 5,000 perpetrators that have not been brought to justice. And how long have these cases been languishing?
This one, it's fascinating and very unfortunate. But in New Mexico and all across the country, this is an issue. But the question is, what's happening in New Mexico? And a lot of people were wondering even why the auditor's office would be involved. And it's somewhat ironic because it's such an important issue, right? Each one of these kits is evidence that the victim gave at one of the most difficult times in their entire life. They had the courage to go in there and get that testing done. And then our government sits on it for 10, 20 years. We found cases in the 80s. And half the cases, almost half, are juveniles. So, it's a major problem. I think the good news is that in large part because of the national trends too, people are waking up, everyone, whether it's law enforcement or government, and they're saying this is important, we need to get it fixed. And so we did get some funding last year, and DPS has been working. They set up a task force to deal with this. And this is a situation where we're saying, okay, everyone wants to do the right thing. Let's make sure it actually gets done. And that's how we've kind of really pushed the pedal down and said, hey, we're going to go around the state and audit these sheriff's departments and see where things are at and see what their proposals are like, and then put forth best practices so that this never happens again.
Something else you're working on, there's always the issue of procurement fraud. Since there's loopholes, there's out-of-state purchasing, and so you have to monitor that our money is being spent in the best way. You have a project you're working on that you can give us a little hint about, but you're not ready. It's not completed yet, so you can't tell us. So what is the project about?
Sure. Well, we have some preliminary findings. Our report is going to be on the dollars that leave the state. They're essentially trickling out, if you will, of our economy. And these, when we say dollars, these are government dollars. So they're really our taxpayer money that goes to the government.
Isn't it like $5 billion in goods and services? That's a lot of dollars.
It is definitely in several billions of dollars. Yeah. And our early indication is then that in the construction industry, which is where we have strong usage of the in-state business preference, almost 3/4 of the dollars stay here at home. And that's a good thing, as it cycles through the economy, creates jobs. But in other industries, in particularly the IT industry and oddly the food service industry and in healthcare, there are hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars leaving our state. And that's our taxpayer money that creates jobs somewhere else, that creates tax revenue somewhere else. And so a lot of people have suspected this for a long time, and it's taken us several years to be able to do this. We're going to be able to put forth the first analysis of where our tax dollars go for procurement, to our knowledge, that's ever been done. And I hope it'll lead to a lot of local economy initiatives where government can actually create jobs.
Yeah. So when you were in the Senate years ago, when were you in the Senate? What were the years?
3 years ago now.
Oh, 3 years. It's not that many years ago.
Started in 2008, I think, is when I got elected.
But you were an advocate of something that you call the Tax Expenditure and Revenue Budget and Reporting. That was a bill. Your co-sponsor was Lucky Varela, who on this show, when he was talking about the reluctance to raise taxes, he flat out said, you got to understand, if you're going to milk this cow, you got to feed it somehow. But what you had suggested was that we take an inventory of every single tax break that we've given, some of which are no longer even relevant anymore. It's practically a tax break for buggy whips. You know, I mean, we need to look at everything. How much does it add up to? And what happened to that bill? Why wouldn't people want to know where we're giving our money away?
You know, this is a fascinating story in government branch of power rivalry. And what that means is really this. Even after years, the first gentleman to pass it was a Republican, Representative Moore from Clayton, Brian Moore, I think was his name.
Brian Moore, yes.
He passed this, and it was a blue ribbon task force bill, and it just requires a return on investment for all our tax credits and deductions and exemptions. Very simple. And Governor Richardson vetoed it, and he had some reasons and so forth. Brian leaves, I come in a couple years later, I run the bill. It passes, and Governor Martinez vetoes it. I take input from Richardson, and we run it again. Unanimously passes, bipartisan sponsorship, this time with Tom Taylor, and it's vetoed again. And the only logical answer is really the following. That is a area of knowledge that no governor wants to give up. And I think in closed quarters, they would tell you just that. They want to hold all those cards so that they can play those cards for all sorts of different reasons. And at the end of the day, that's why, I think folks are convinced this is probably always going to get vetoed unless it's done maybe in the last year or the first year of a governor's term where they want to stand up and prove a point that they believe in tax reform and transparency. But until that happens, we've now seen over the course of 16 years a universal agreement by executives that they do not want this kind of report.
Can the people call for it? I mean, it makes sense. I mean, we give airplane mechanics breaks, and we give breweries breaks. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And if
And
we
there's
started
hundreds of tax breaks.
hundreds, if we started a zero-based plan where we have to give, I mean, the film industry gets breaks. A lot of very popular industries get breaks. But if we started zero-based and just put them back in one at a time, if we want to that they proved that there was a return on investment and that it was relevant to our times, it seems like any sensible person. Is it too much to ask?
Well, and this is, I know John Arthur and a lot of
Yes.
Senator Smith, a lot of folks have said, why don't we sort of gradually sunset them all? But if they show up and make a good case, we'll keep them around. But really, that's the challenge, is that all of these are a reflection of a very good lobby effort or a very good public need. So some, there's low income tax credits in there, there's renewable energy. Every industry, whether you're blue or green or red, partisan wise, we've all got our tax breaks. And that's why this is so hard to deal with, because for that particular group, this is the sacred cow, and they will do everything they can to stop it. And now we have hundreds of those groups. And they also add volatility to the budget, because we have like a Swiss cheese budget policy. So now we whipsaw up and down much, much more than we would if we didn't have those. So I'm convinced it takes a governor. A governor has to stand
Leadership.
up and mandate that. That is the only person who can really get that done.
Well, you have your job security. If your job is to battle waste and fraud in the state, you're golden. You have a lot of work to do. But just tell us, I want to thank you for your efforts, because you've worked really hard on this. But what can we do? What can the citizen do?
Thank you for asking about that, actually. I think at the end of the day, try and, if you can, I know it's not the most glamorous thing to do, try and notice your respective entity's audit in one form or another. Maybe you read about it in the paper, or you ask your city councilor about it, or your mutual domestic water association board member. Audits matter, and that's where all this data comes from. So take an interest in that with your local official. And then I think secondly, participate in the electoral process. Voter turnout is what it is. And I think for better or worse, we all can live with the government that we vote in. But since only half of us typically vote, and sometimes lower, we get so frustrated. And so please vote, even for those school board elections in February and those city elections in October.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Our guest today is Tim Keller, the auditor for the state of New Mexico. Thank you so much for all you do.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.